Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to the prestigious Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecture 2020. It's fantastic that we can all get together virtually for this very special event, and it's great to have so many of you joining us. Although you may not be able to see each other face to face, you can use the chat tab to connect to one another, and the questions tab to submit questions to our Casson lecturer, as later we will have time for a short Q&A session. First held in 1973, this annual lecture is held in honour of Dr. Elizabeth Casson and her contributions to the occupational therapy profession. As the first woman awarded a medical degree from the University of Bristol in 1919, Dr. Casson introduced occupational therapy to England, and in 1929, she established the first occupational therapy school, Dorset House in Bristol. In recognition of Dr. Elizabeth Casson's commitment to further occupational therapy, the lectureship is an honour awarded to a Royal College of Occupational Therapists member who is considered by their peers to have made and to be making significant contributions to the profession's development. In her personal and professional capacity as an RCOT member, Dr. Stephanie Tempest, Professional Development Manager at the Royal College, nominated this year's lecturer. I would now like to invite Dr. Tempest to introduce the 2020 Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecturer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julia. And welcome everybody, and welcome to my lounge. Although I'm absolutely thrilled, and it's nothing personal that I can't see you all in person equally. Thank you so much for inviting me to be the warm-up act for this year's virtual Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecture. When I started to think about how to approach the task in hand, I identified a number of ways that I could introduce Jenny to you. Not that she really needs that much introduction. Firstly, I thought I could share with you a potted history of her career. Qualified for over 35 years, not that she'll thank me for telling you that, worked for the last decade as a consultant, highest level consultant occupational therapist, supervised 18 master's students, 5 doctoral level students and counting, appointed honorary associate professor at the University of Stirling, and the first non-medical director of rehabilitation in Scotland. All impressive and very relevant, but not the reasons I nominated her. So I thought I could walk you through all of her post-nominals. For example, the PhD, the MBE, the Fellowship of the Royal College of Occupational Therapists, but I only have 5 minutes for this introduction, so it would take me far too long. And again, as impressive and as well-deserved as they are again not the reason I nominated her. So thankfully, when I saw the content of Jenny's lecture and the title, I found the answer I was looking for. So I'm going to briefly share with you my truths in terms of the impact that Jenny has had on my career, including on my professional and my personal development. I'm also going to touch on the ripple effects this has had for others that I've served in the course of my career so far, including people who access occupational therapy services, students, colleagues, and all the people that I've served so far. There have been 3 different phases in my occupational therapy career to date, and without a doubt, Jenny has influenced all of them. We have a shared clinical background in neuro rehab, and this saw me engage and apply Jenny's research and her scholarly activity to inform my own practice. We are both involved in the specialist section for neurological practice, and I still value today the work that we've done and that we do to support the learning for others in this specialist field at all career levels. As an academic, I drew upon Jenny's expertise in practice and her research knowledge to facilitate learning with pre-registration and postgraduate students, who themselves were then able to feel the benefit and impact of Jenny's work on their own learning and practice. And as I said before, I see these ripple effects of evidence It's evidence of Jenny's impact. They may be hard to measure, but nonetheless, they're definitely there. In my current roles with the education and charitable sectors, including for the professional body, Jenny continues to make a significant impact on me, this time in terms of my own leadership style. I observe, respect, and in all honesty, marvel at the authenticity, the candour, and the humour that Jenny brings to the leadership work that she does. I value the belly laughs just as much as the light bulb moments. And to feel the impact for myself from the leadership advice and guidance that Jenny has provided is something for which I'm very grateful. On a personal level, the truth is that Jenny's ability to draw on her own lived experience in dealing with illness and loss makes a huge impact on me too. She is accessible, relatable, and at all times professional in how she does this. As a role model in our profession, she has helped teach me to embrace my own vulnerabilities, to learn from my own challenges, which we all have, and then to try my best to use them as strengths. She is a true leader by example. So in short, there are two main reasons I nominated Jenny. One, because she's a leader of our profession and an expert occupational therapist across all 4 pillars of practice. And two, because in my 23-year career to date, she's made a significant impact on my professional and personal self. So in nominating her for this lecture, I have selfishly created another opportunity to learn with and from her. But this time, it's not entirely selfish, as I get to share this opportunity with all of you. So I invite you for the next 45 minutes or so to join me in turning down the volume on the noise and the very real distractions that inhabit our world at the moment, and to immerse ourselves fully in the privilege and the luxury that is space to listen, space to learn, and space to reflect on what we are about to hear. And I'll leave you with one question to think about. How can I apply what I learn in order to make a positive impact of my own for the people I serve now and the people I will serve in the future? So without further ado, it's time to welcome the main act to the virtual stage, the very impactful, the very truthful, and the very impressive Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecturer for 2020, Dr. Jenny Preston.
Thank you, Julia and Stephanie, for your very kind and generous introductions. Good evening and a very warm welcome to our virtual community. I wish to express my sincere gratitude to Dr. Stephanie Tempest for nominating me and to the Council of the Royal College of Occupational Therapists for bestowing this immense honour and privilege upon me, following in the history of so many great and esteemed colleagues. Throughout this lecture, I hope to encourage reflection, challenge perceptions, inspire, and offer an innovative way forward to demonstrate the impact of occupational therapy. Impact is defined in the Oxford Dictionary as the action of one object coming forcibly into contact with another. But perhaps that's not the best start to the lecture. I have therefore opted for the slightly safer choice of defining impact as having a strong influence on someone or something. Outbreaks of disease have devastated civilization from ancient to modern times, frequently altering the course of history. This lecture was crafted within the context of a global pandemic, a worldwide spread of a new disease, coronavirus, more commonly known as COVID-19. Globally, we have been challenged by our response to this new disease and the need to adapt to change as the latest information becomes available. Inevitably, the experiences and insights gained throughout the pandemic will in themselves alter the course of history for the occupational therapy profession. During the year 2020, we have witnessed significant changes in the world as we know it. Wimbledon was cancelled for the first time since World War II. We observed the cancellation of the greatest show on earth, the Olympic and Paralympic Games, and of course, the Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecture due to take place in April at King's Place, London, to an audience of members and distinguished guests of the Royal College of Occupational Therapists was postponed. The 2020 Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecture was intended to mark an historic occasion within the prestigious lecture series, as for the first time in its history, the lecture was to be streamed simultaneously to a live and virtual audience. How times have changed, and what was perceived to be innovative has become a cultural norm within 6 months, with the rapid uptake of digital solutions, which has radically changed many aspects of our lives. The historians amongst us may already be aware that disruption to this annual lecture has occurred on 2 previous occasions since the inaugural lecture in 1973. Hester Monteith was sadly unable to deliver her lecture in 1989 due to ill health, and in 1994 there was no Casson lecture scheduled due to the World Federation of Occupational Therapy Congress. With disruption, however, comes opportunity, and the coronavirus has shone a light on change at all levels within the profession. No one has been immune from the impact of the pandemic, and occupational therapy as a profession has had to respond to the challenge, developing resilience and envisioning a future state in which barriers were removed and creative responses developed through innovation and collaboration. In a time of such overwhelming change, however, it is somewhat reassuring to reflect on the social context as Dr. Elizabeth Casson was developing an interest in occupational therapy, and acknowledge, quite remarkably, that many of the challenges remain current within our modern day societies. The perspectives within which Dr. Casson applied her underlying philosophies attests that much of what we currently do as occupational therapists is in fact not new, as she accessed a range of approaches developed within the concepts of disease prevention, health promotion, lessening inequalities, and building a spirit of community. Dr. Casson's holistic, communal, and participatory model anticipated contemporary occupational therapy practice. Arguably, it is the access to an enhanced occupational narrative with advanced professional reasoning and academically developed theoretical concepts that has changed, subsequently affording us as the profession the opportunity to more fluently express what we do and the impact this creates. The challenges to our knowledge, specialised language, professional values and beliefs has never been greater for the profession if we're truly committed to the confident articulation of our real value. We have been confronted throughout this pandemic with the constructs of truth and certainty, fake news and misinformation. Within this lecture, I intend to contest our underlying assumptions of truth and certainty by considering how we generate, create, and understand knowledge within the occupational therapy profession. Through the principles of process re-engineering, I will seek to define, analyse, and identify how we interpret and apply that knowledge within our broad understanding of truth to capture the impact of occupational therapy. Finally, I will attempt to design and develop a future state in which evidence and practice are entwined to create the best possible outcomes. History is defined as the continuous systematic narrative of past events. Occupational therapy is the architect of our future. Throughout this pandemic, we have observed a greater perceived importance of the role of science in contributing to our understanding of this new disease in aspects of epidemiology, disease course, identifying the most vulnerable populations, spread, and longer-term consequences. There has been an insatiable yearning to develop the evidence base to inform global and national strategies, demanding an agile response to developing that evidence. We have observed and experienced firsthand the consequences when science and politics collide, with a frequently devastating impact on health, well-being, and the wider economy. Within my leadership role, I have felt an inherent responsibility for colleagues as we have individually and collectively navigated our way through the disease spending our time searching for facts, while as an observer trying to make sense of the relational interplay between evidence, feelings, values, and beliefs. This is frequently manifested within personal and professional discourses that characterise the contradiction between enacting behaviours based on the principles of doing the right thing or the right thing to do. In our quest, we have struggled to manage uncertainty while appreciating the need for multiple perspectives, used critical thinking and adapted at pace, all anchored within our own interpretations and versions of the truth. Truth is defined in many ways, but generally conforms to relational concepts of verified or indisputable facts, honesty, integrity, and truthfulness. There is, of course, much philosophical debate about the theories of truth, and with some philosophers postulating a need for a distinction between the definitions versus the criteria of truth. Within this conceptual framework, a definition gives meaning to the word true, whereby criterion gives a test by means of which to tell whether a sentence or hypothesis is true or false. Russell, in his theory of mathematical logic, used the example of the meaning of feverish, a very topical example, to illustrate this point. To be feverish, according to Russell, means the existence of a temperature higher than some given point, usually 38 degrees Celsius. Criterion, conversely, would require the specification of procedures for deciding whether someone is feverish, such as the presence of symptoms including sweating, chills and shivers, headache, and redness of the skin. However, this distinction requires careful handling, as suspicions may arise by the existence of disagreement about which theories of truth count as definitional and which as criterial. For others, however, truth is not about the meaning of a word or the content of a concept, but is understood within the context of a phenomenon, situated within our beliefs in an ontological sense, and to which we have some form of connection or relationship. Theoretically, there are two opposing ontological positions defined within the realist and relativist paradigms. Within the realist paradigm, knowledge is sought to provide logical and methodical connections with the underlying assumption that everything in the world can be objectively quantified. In the opposing relativist paradigm, knowledge is developed through an understanding of socially constructed meanings unique to individuals or groups of individuals which are experientially based. For us as occupational therapists, this can contribute further discord as we seek to understand the influences of our own unique knowledge, assumptions, and beliefs on our interpretation of the truth. This frequently requires us to make a declaration or take an ontological stance, demonstrating allegiance to either of the two domains. The reality, of course, is that much of our knowledge is developed within a range of perspectives, creating further challenge. The emergence of the critical realist paradigm, however, offers occupational therapists a position of middle ground between the two competing paradigms of realists and relativists, where there remains a requirement for objectivity while thoroughly investigating the phenomenon. Epistemology is the study of what can be counted as knowledge, where knowledge is located, and how knowledge increases. The complex relationship between the concepts of knowledge and certainty has contributed much debate and lack of agreement between philosophers as to whether the two constructs are the same, or if not, how do they differ? Within the occupational therapy profession, we experience 4 types of certainty. I feel certain that this is the right way to manage this condition, as I believe I have read something about it. I am certain that this is the right intervention, as I'm aware that others are using this technique. I know for certain, as we have always done it this way, and it is certain that this approach will result in specific improvements as demonstrated through evidence. The concepts of truth and certainty lie predominantly within the sociological ideology of modernism, from which grew a desire to identify universal truths. Modernism was primarily concerned with the principles of identity, unity, authority, and certainty, and is frequently understood within occupational therapy to be responsible for the much maligned Western scientific model, contributing to a misunderstanding of occupational therapy as a low-status profession. Often considered as the more dominant discourse, modernism was attributed the alienation of groups such as women, people with disabilities, and cultural minorities. Within a postmodernism ideology, judgments of truth exist within a cultural context and was believed by many within the profession to engender a growing societal awareness of power, diversity, temporality, and situatedness. While postmodernism has enabled occupational therapists to challenge existing societal views, there are counterclaims that it has also destabilised occupational therapy's own identity by confronting the more conventional and trusted mechanistic approaches that had proven useful over time. Throughout the ideological and theoretical development of philosophy, sociology, ontology, and epistemology, opposing paradigms have existed, reflective of the internal debates within the occupational therapy profession. Existential challenges such as reductionism versus holism, quantitative over qualitative, occupational therapy or occupational science, and East as opposed to West ideologies have dominated, and we occasionally find ourselves as occupational therapists struggling to decide which principles to assert. This leads me to wonder how this relational concept of truth might impact on occupational therapists at an individual level, and how might we attain middle ground without compromise? Dr. Elizabeth Casson was in herself the embodiment of this dichotomy, a white, female medical graduate, influenced by her social activist friends and colleagues. A slight digression perhaps, but if we accept this relational concept of truth, this also leads me to be curious about the potential influence on our own career choices as occupational therapists. Do our own individual versions of the truth influence our choice of clinical area, academic or research interests, or even influence our career choice of occupational therapy in the first place? Or conversely, is our worldview shaped by our experiences within our areas of professional interest? Now there's an interesting research question for someone. As we move into a postmodernism or metamodernism era, perhaps we can herald an age in which we find ways of practicing that satisfy both biomedical and occupation-focused demands. However, who will decide this and advocate on behalf of the profession? How comfortable are we as a profession in challenging our core values and beliefs through scholarly debate? And how much do we rely on reputational privilege and authority to inform our future direction? Dr. Casson led the way for occupational therapy, and it is incumbent on this current generation of occupational therapists to develop and implement the strategies for future change. Essentially, truth is about the existence and nature of a relationship between belief and fact. According to Plato, absolute truth is something that is true at all times and in all places. It is something that is always true, no matter what the circumstances. It is a fact that cannot be changed. It is therefore proposed that within occupational therapy, like pure mathematics, there is no absolute truth. We invent rules, then see what they prove, or see what is consistent with them. Many of the truths that we cling to depend on our point of view. Occupational therapy is a complex intervention. Of that, there is no debate. Yet as a profession, we need to be mindful that we do not fall victim to complexity bias. Complexity bias describes a logical fallacy that leads us to give undue credence to complex concepts. Inherent within this is the belief that complex solutions are better than simple ones, and the assumption that complexity always outperforms simplicity. As a profession, we notoriously like to make things difficult for ourselves. It is without doubt that occupational therapy as a profession requires to continue to develop and produce high-quality research evidence in a format that can be published and disseminated within the most prestigious platforms. However, as a professional and academic discipline, we engage with a wide range of audiences that require us to deliver the key messages about the role, purpose, and value of occupational therapy, incorporating differing perspectives. Therefore, we need a repertoire of communication skills and language to enable us to talk to different audiences. Over 30 years ago, Christine Craik, in her editorial in the British Journal of Occupational Therapy, challenged the profession that in order to convince others of the merit of occupational therapy, we must first reaffirm our own fundamental belief in its value. Craik asked, how often do we shrink from the task of explaining our work to others, to those who ask, and more especially to those who do not? I was recently challenged in my own clinical practice by a client who asked me, what is your role in all of this? I pondered momentarily, then confidently responded with, my role is to understand how your meaningful activities impact on your overall health and well-being. Somewhat proud of myself, I expected some positive affirmation, but of course that was not to be. My client's response, come again? Even more pleased with myself, I had remembered what I'd said previously and was able to rehearse it verbatim. She turned to me and said, well, that's quite a mantra, but what on earth does it mean? Evidence, of course, that despite the significant developments in occupational therapy research evidence, continually evolving theoretical concepts, and increasing confidence in our professional language, we still find it hard as a profession to define and justify occupational therapy to others. These challenges are regularly articulated through social media platforms such as #OTAL and the recent publication of the Royal College of Occupational Therapists' research priorities. So, as occupational therapists, what do we do? Perhaps you're drawn to the subliminal message which seeks to ask, what are your meaningful occupations? And the relevance of this in the way that Dr. Casson used her own meaningful occupations to shape and inform the development of our profession. Or alternatively, we can draw on linguistics and apply the technique of contrasted stress, a method used in phonetics to change the emphasis and the meaning of words, subsequently impacting on the message we're trying to get across. In the statement, what do we do? The impact of the message changes quite significantly depending on which of the four words is emphasised. When the emphasis is placed on what, the pronoun is used interrogatively as a request for specific information. In this context, it seeks a definition of occupational therapy. There are, of course, a number of professional definitions accessible to us as occupational therapists, but we must question how relevant and appropriate they are to our wider audiences. If we move the emphasis to do, and the introduction of a verb implies a need for action, the emphasis and tone becomes more apparent within this context, representing a challenge in the form of questions and more negative sentences. Implicit within this emphasis is the actual question, what happens next? How do we respond to this line of questioning within occupational therapy practice? And how confident are we in describing our theories, processes, interventions, and outcomes to others? When the emphasis is placed on you, also a pronoun, this immediately becomes more personal to the one or ones being addressed. Here the reference could be to each of us as an individual, inquiring about our specific contribution as an occupational therapist. But of course it may be broadened out to the profession as a whole. Nevertheless, it seeks to articulate clarity, definitive actions, roles and responsibilities. While there may be a perception that this emphasis is negatively challenging, we must be mindful that it is a question that we regularly ask of our service users to help us understand their occupations. The emphasis on you evokes an emotional response, frequently resulting in oversensitivity, with occupational therapists feeling the need to apologetically or defensively justify the self and the profession. Finally, when we place the emphasis on the second do, it calls for action, the precise nature of which is often unspecific. Within the context of this lecture, I have chosen to interpret this do as the so what aspect of occupational therapy, allowing us to begin to explore the concept of impact and occupational therapy. The concept of and the measurement of impact originated within business and is considered to be central to an organisation's strategy and understanding of how it is meeting its mission and vision in the longer term. More recently, the need for measuring social impact has become more relevant as organisations try to define, recognise and capture the full meaning of the effects of their activities. Within the academic environment, there is also increasing recognition of the need to demonstrate impact with the expectations that research investment should lead to improvements in policy, practice, resource allocation, and ultimately the health and well-being of the community. Understanding, measuring, and communicating impact is extremely important for the occupational therapy profession, as we are increasingly expected to be accountable, to produce value for money, reduce waste, and deliver effective practice. Impact assessment is complex in practice and varies in approach and rigour, with a number of methodologies and practices emerging from different organisations accessing experimental and quasi-experimental methods. Research impact assessment in itself is recognised as a new field of scientific endeavour, with the development of specialised literature on the science of research impact assessment, theory development, and the taxonomy of method in this complex and rapidly growing field of inquiry. Recent years have seen the development of a number of conceptual frameworks that can assist in better describing and understanding the impact of research. Conceptual frameworks can help organise data collection, analysis, and reporting to promote clarity and consistency in the impact assessments. In their 2016 systematic review, Greenhalgh et al. Identified over 20 different research impact assessment models and frameworks. However, these models share a multidimensional approach fundamentally structured around categorisation and integration of the many dimensions of benefit, with the application of a set of indicators and metrics assigned to each category of impact. These frameworks, however, differ in their language and approaches, leading to a lack of a common understanding of terminology and metrics, making the task of quantifying research efforts, outputs, and ultimately performance in this area more difficult. And of course, a further challenge exists in deciding who determines impact. In their systematic review, Mila et al. Somewhat astonishingly identified only 4 studies where non-academic end users of research were interviewed within the impact assessment processes, with the vast majority of studies relying on principal investigator interviews and/or peer review processes to assess impacts. Comprehensive monitoring and measurement of impact is a complex undertaking requiring the involvement of many actors. Within all aspects of occupational therapy practice, claims about making a difference are no longer sufficient. Evidence of how much difference we are making is now required. However, practice impacts, like research impacts, are complex, non-linear, and unpredictable in nature, and there is a propensity to count what can be easily measured rather than measuring what counts in terms of significant, enduring change. The links between research, clinical practice, and impact are complex, indirect, and hard to attribute. In 2014, my father was diagnosed with Lewy body disease, incorporating the challenges of a movement disorder with dementia. Like many other families, we were fully aware of the progressive nature of his condition and almost immediately set out our plans to support him to live at home for as long as possible. My father was to be referred to the occupational therapist within the local Parkinson's team. With each change in Dad's condition came a solution from the occupational therapist, always appropriate, always timely, and always successful in overcoming the challenge. As every item of equipment was delivered, there was much enthusiasm by all family members regarding the ingenuity of the solutions. That was, of course, except for me, already familiar with the solutions and regularly taking much for granted as an occupational therapist. Provision of a stair lift and a riser recliner chair were critical in supporting my dad to remain at home, with the benefits being celebrated by extended family members as they could witness the difference these items made at a very practical level for both my parents. Sadly, my father passed away earlier this year. The real impact of occupational therapy, however, did not become apparent to me until my father's funeral. During his eulogy, the minister reminded us that my parents had stood at the very same altar 58 years earlier on their wedding day, making a commitment to love, honour and cherish in sickness and in health. Suddenly, the true impact of occupational therapy had become apparent to me. Occupational therapy had supported my mother to honour the commitment she made that day. However, the occupational therapist is unlikely to be aware of this level of impact, and probably, if asked, would talk about the outcomes for my father in relation to his daily activities, reduced burden of care, environmental adaptation to suit individual needs, avoidance of hospital admission, or even saved bed days. All of this, of course, is true. The reality, however, for my family is that the impact of occupational therapy transcends both life and death and has undoubtedly contributed to a positive bereavement experience free from frustration, guilt, anger, and hopelessness. And of course, the evidence confirms this positive impact of supporting someone living with a long-term condition and how it can continue to affect families after death, despite the end to caregiving. But how often do you hear an occupational therapist respond in that way to the question, what do you do? Drawing again on my clinical experience, I want to share, with permission, an example of the impact of occupational therapy at an individual level. I will call him Ryan, who I first met when he was 16 years old. He'd reached the point when he was expected to transition from child health to adult services. I met with Ryan, who told me of his ambitions to become a writer. Ryan has a diagnosis of cerebral palsy, which presented some challenges in relation to sensation, mobility, stamina, and tolerance. Ryan was no longer attending school because he had been assaulted in school and was unable to return for fear of meeting his attacker face to face. He was now unable to leave his home, unable to complete his education, and unable to fulfill his hopes and dreams. Ryan was using a simple handheld device for creative writing as a coping strategy, with little capacity for storage or functionality. Ryan had two main goals in life. He wanted to study literature at university, and he wanted to learn to drive. We worked together through a goal-setting approach to develop key and achievable milestones. However, Ryan needed access to more robust equipment, and he had no finance available to pay for his provisional driving licence, barriers, of course, to moving forward with the plan. Following identification of a funding source and support to complete the application process, Ryan was subsequently awarded funding to purchase a laptop and printer and the cost of 40 driving lessons. Gradually, we worked collaboratively through the goal-directed behaviours as agreed, reinforced by a visual approach to goal attainment, which Ryan had complete ownership of. Ryan successfully passed his driving test in January. He has now completed his second year in college. He has a clear academic plan in place, which will facilitate him in time to graduate with an honours degree. Of course, there is nothing unique about this story, and every one of us involved tonight and beyond can articulate similar successful outcomes further to occupational therapy intervention. What I urge you all to do, however, is to look beyond the obvious, beyond the interventions and the outcomes, just because they are easier to count. Think about the impact of occupational therapy. It's hard, isn't it? And I also couldn't see beyond the obvious. That was, of course, until I spoke with Ryan's mum. Her response was, "Thank you for giving me my son back. Once again, if I was asked about the impact of occupational therapy, I would respond by saying that I had supported Ryan into college and wider participation within his community. It is unlikely that I would have said that my interventions had a positive impact on health determinants by co-creating security, education, social justice, and equity. The impact of occupational therapy extends beyond the individual level, and increasingly occupational therapists are effecting societal change through increased political awareness and opportunities to influence the development of policy and shape legislation. The underpinning theoretical constructs of occupational therapy, together with access to a range of ideologies, facilitates an enabling philosophy, giving people increased control over their health by accessing information, developing life skills, and creating opportunities to make healthy choices. A recent example of this is through my own contribution to the development of national frameworks, such as Neurological Care and Support in Scotland, a framework for action, and the Health Improvement Scotland General Standards for Neurological Care and Support. Impact assessment methodologies could potentially support the occupational therapy profession to report impact while communicating with various audiences. They have the potential to inform the occupational therapy profession by understanding where occupational therapists are effecting social change, in addition to indicating how and where as a profession we are required to enhance our efforts. I acknowledge that this lecture is set within a specific cultural context and recognise that further scholarly efforts are required to discuss and integrate various worldviews. Much of the current evidence of impact has been developed from studies conducted predominantly in Australia, United Kingdom and North America, further perpetuating Western influences. It may also, however, potentially indicate a precursory need for the development of more mature and advancing health and social systems, wealth and quality of life to facilitate the meaningful assessment of impact. Occupational therapy is reported to have been initiated during World War I by Sir Robert Jones. It was in fact King George VI's speech to mark the end of the war to which I have drawn my inspiration for the future state of occupational therapy. Within his speech, His Majesty the King spoke of constancy, courage, faith, and unity. I have sought to apply this specifically within the context of this lecture from a perspective of challenging occupational therapy's future version of the truth. Within our future state, constancy will seek to establish and define the faithful, dependable, enduring, and unchanging dimensions of our profession. This will require courage to move beyond our comfort zone, which in turn may elicit fear and which will inevitably require bravery and strength. Faith, often considered within the context of theology, refers to the prospect of occupational therapy as a profession having a complete trust or confidence in what we do, upon which a strong belief is created, informed by the evidence and knowledge that we generate. Unity depicts a stance of being together or at one as a profession. Quite simply, let us be bold as we move forward together as a profession that delivers a consistent and honest message based on the strength of our evidence and our beliefs. As we envision a future state incorporating both how we measure and articulate impact, we must consider this within the context of the paradigms of evidence, language, and actions, or quite simply, what we know, how we see it, and what we do as a profession. The scientific and professional integrity of our profession requires theories to be informed by a diversity of perspectives with human connection, demonstrating positive exchange of energy between people who are paying attention to each other, to build trust and inspire change. Occupational therapy requires considerable investment in the development of high-quality research and agile responses to the generation of evidence that speaks for itself in terms of broadening our own and others' understanding of the real value of occupational therapy. However, the generation of evidence in itself is not sufficient. The process by which new knowledge is translated into policy and practice is complex, variable, and frequently slow. More than 90 terms have been used within the literature to describe the concept of the use of research knowledge, including research impact, knowledge translation, implementation science, utilisation, uptake, dissemination and diffusion, benefit, and payback. This lack of consistency of language in itself illustrates the extent of the challenge. How and to what extent research knowledge is translated into policy and practice is of course also emerging as an important field of research. As a profession, we must find creative responses to innovation, spread of knowledge and collaboration. We must discover novel strategies that enable adaptation to change within our practice as new evidence becomes available. We must also demand evidence that facilitates a quicker return on investment by supporting the profession to select the most effective and cost-effective interventions so that quality and appropriateness can be maximised if we are genuinely committed to improving the health and well-being of our communities. We require a common endeavour through practitioners, service users, educators, researchers and professional leaders working together through international collaborations to ensure that research questions are relevant to policy and practice, while at the same time ensuring that policy and practice are evidence-based. This should be informed by local, national and global strategy, variation and diversity. We need to move beyond a model of client-centeredness in which we position the person at the centre of decision-making to a genuine model of co-production in which we make better use of each other's assets, resources and contributions to achieve better outcomes or improved efficiency. Co-production contributes to a breaking down of barriers between people who use, inform and deliver occupational therapy services based on the principles of reciprocity, mutuality and trust. We must truly embed meaningful patient and public involvement in our version of the truth at every stage of the occupational therapy process, including in practice, strategic leadership, education and research. Occupational therapy needs to move beyond the reputation of a profession that delivers middle-class solutions to middle-class problems. I learned recently of an excellent example of how not to tackle an aspect of health inequalities, and while not specific to occupational therapy, illustrates the challenges we face as a profession. In an attempt to address the issue of low-income families being able to provide food for their children, a local solution was to provide Farm Foods vouchers. Farm Foods is a British frozen food supermarket chain and was selected on the basis that it does not sell alcohol or tobacco. Implicit within this example are a number of false and damaging underlying assumptions: that families would prioritise the purchase of alcohol and tobacco above providing food for their children, access to a shop which may not be within the local community, ownership of a freezer, and an ability to pay for electricity. The solution does not educate or support families to make healthy life choices and potentially reinforces negative and unhelpful stereotypes. Inequalities cannot be addressed by imposing the same solutions on everyone. In addition to developing our own evidence base, we must also contribute to and learn from the wider scientific endeavours, particularly within the context of the theoretical development of impact assessment. Current evidence appears to confirm that existing models of impact assessment align well with the demands of the occupational therapy profession, both in terms of language and content, with no necessity at this stage to develop a discipline-specific conceptual framework. The requirements of occupational therapy as a profession in describing and demonstrating impact are not unique, but it is the application of the theoretical construct of impact assessment within the context of occupational therapy that requires further consideration. Within the profession, we must reach consensus on the dimensions of impact to enable the development of indicators and metrics conducive to demonstrating and articulating the real value of occupational therapy. Furthermore, as occupational therapists, we have an imperative to ensure that in measuring impact, we reflect the importance of diversity in our practice, our populations, and our profession. Various attempts have been made within the occupational therapy profession to demonstrate impact. Further analysis of the evidence, however, concludes additional inconsistencies in the way we use the language available to us, with significant overlap between effect, outcomes, and impact, with synonymous use of the terminology despite their underlying differences. Impact extends beyond inputs and outputs to report on and articulate the social change that has occurred, subsequently illustrating the real-world value of occupational therapy. The language of impact assessment is closely affiliated with the language of occupational therapy and can be defined within three key constructs of societal, economic, and conceptual. It is perhaps appropriate at this point to return to the metaphorical action of one object coming forcibly into contact with another. It struck me from both the ideology and the language that a conceptual framework may already exist within occupational therapy that will allow us to illustrate the narrative of impact assessment within a visual context. The person, environment, occupation model is used extensively to inform the development of clinical reasoning skills and clinical practice, built on the theory that the interaction of the person, environment, and occupation facilitate participation. It is assumed that where a good fit of these constructs occurs, meaningful participation increases, whereas a poor fit can threaten engagement or performance and could negatively impact on health and wellness. The quality of the person, environment, occupation interaction is defined by the quality of a person's experience with regard to their level of satisfaction and functioning. It is therefore postulated that the process of impact assessment can also be articulated through the use of the person, environment, occupation framework to illustrate the relationships between the three constructs. Person within the context of impact assessment relates to the individual, families, communities, including, for example, colleagues, politicians, the World Health Organization, populations and cultures, shaped, for example, by race, ethnicity, class, sexual identity, disability, age, religion, financial status, culture, or language. Environment describes the context within which impact is being assessed and incorporates aspects of local, national, international, academic, practice, policy, and economic environments. Occupations is the term used to depict the categorization of activities attributed to the actions of demonstrating impact. The evidence incorporates a comprehensive list of actions and behaviours which can be interpreted as the characteristics that define the process of creating impact. Further thematic analysis allows categorisation within the key themes of informing and influencing policy, knowledge production, shifting understanding, practice and service change, value for money, improved outcomes, behaviour change, health benefits, and return on investment. As within the practice context, where a good fit of these constructs occurs, meaningful impact increases, whereas a poor fit can threaten our ability as a profession to demonstrate and articulate the real value of occupational therapy. Occupational therapists operate within increasingly competitive markets for scarce resources and opportunities. However, the current political context is both right and ripe to define, articulate, and evidence the demonstrable contribution that occupational therapy makes to the individual, society, and the economy. As a profession, we understand the importance of occupational therapy in creating effective and cost-effective solutions to the current day global challenges. However, in order to position our profession with the greatest chances of success, we need to effect behavioural change through shifting our understanding and advancing scientific knowledge while developing the capacity to enable the profession to become both proactive and responsive to change. Occupational therapy as a profession must position itself to both influence and develop policy, practice, and service provision by understanding policy issues, shaping legislation, and reframing the debates. In conclusion, my intention throughout this lecture was to inspire, motivate, and challenge our thinking as a profession, while offering and encouraging new ways of thinking about and writing about what we do as occupational therapists and the real value of our profession as it continues to build its reputation. Marilyn Pattison, in her editorial in the British Journal of Occupational Therapy in 2008, challenged us as occupational therapists to develop the capacity and power to construct our own destiny, acclaiming that the future of the profession is ours to make. According to Pattison, in 20 years or 100 years' time, our success will be the only reliable measure of how effectively we have taken hold of our vision. Can we truly envision a future state in which we are no longer required to explain, justify, and articulate the real meaning of occupational therapy, but one in which occupational therapy is understood and taken as a given? I believe we can. There are, of course, a number of people that I would like to thank for making this incredible opportunity possible. Thank you, Dr. Stephanie Tempest, for having the confidence in me and my abilities, and for all the energy required in preparing and submitting the nomination. Thank you also to Stephanie and to Dr. Edward Duncan for your enduring support, encouragement, and positive challenges as the lecture has evolved. I would also like to thank the late and very great Dr. Anne Wilcock for her exceptional curation of the history of occupational therapy, and to my dear friend Dr. Catherine Patterson, not only for her outstanding contribution to recording the history, but also for taking a chance on me in 1981 and allowing me to enter this wonderful profession. I would like to thank the former Casson lecturers for their support and encouragement, and also to my family, especially my husband Stuart and son Matthew, who have listened so attentively tonight as if it was the first time they had heard the lecture. I have had the most exceptional opportunities throughout my career, and thanks to everyone who has made that possible. Finally, I would like to thank Dr. Claire Ballinger, my former PhD supervisor, who is responsible for nurturing my inquiring mind, critical thinking, and enhanced interpretive skills. Dad, I hope I have made you proud.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for your absolutely brilliant, multi-layered lecture. I know I have many questions, as do our audience. However, we are aware, colleagues, there has been an issue with the chat function this evening, which our streaming provider has tried to resolve, and apologies to anybody affected. We did have a number of questions come through, which we will now go through. And if you do have any other questions, I think we will try and ensure that those questions do get to Jenny and we can answer those in due course. So to start us off, Jenny, this evening, I have a question for you from Caroline Jefferson from West Sussex County Council, who asks, can you envisage how occupational therapists might work post-COVID?
Thank you, Caroline. Well, that is a really interesting question, isn't it? And I think there's work already beginning to emerge in terms of how occupational therapists are both thinking about and understanding their contribution, particularly within the context of long COVID in particular. I think it's interesting, and clearly there is much focus currently within the Royal College of Occupational Therapists on rehabilitation. And as a rehabilitation therapist, I'm absolutely thrilled that we're seeing this as a key aspect currently within the profession. And I think, you know, there's lots of discussion here that could take us well beyond this evening. But I think it comes back to, you know, the holistic nature of how we work as occupational therapists and understanding it not just in the context of a new condition or of a new set of symptoms, but really for us to truly understand what that means for people, and the impact that it does have on their meaningful occupations. And I think it's really key as we move forward and where there are opportunities for occupational therapists to demonstrate and to evidence and articulate the contributions that they're making at an individual level, but also, you know, at the society level, and also how we can contribute to the wider economy. This is a really, really good example of everything that we need to be able to do to really truly demonstrate the impact that we can have.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jenny. I have another question, and apologies to the person that asked this question. I know you are Catherine, but I don't know where you're from. So her question is quite an open question, Jenny, I'll warn you. What would your next best research question be, no holds barred, i.e. you had all the funding you wanted, resources and time?
Oh, now there's an opportunity, isn't there? Oh, well, there's a question. I posed a question within the lecture tonight about our sort of interpretations of the truth, our individual interpretations of the truth, and how or does that impact on our decisions that we make, both prior to becoming occupational therapists and subsequent to. It's massive, isn't it? It's absolutely massive. I mean, you know, clearly my passions are around neurological conditions. So invariably, for me, at a very personal level, it would be undoubtedly in relation to some aspect of you know, management of neurological conditions. But you know, equally, I'm passionate as an occupational therapist about everything that we do. So anything that can combine occupational therapy with neurological conditions probably would be my preference, but I'd love to engage with the wider community around how they would answer that question. That's a really difficult one on the spot.
Yeah, absolutely, Jenny. I have another question here. It's actually from one of our occupational therapy students in the audience. I'm afraid I don't have their name, but they asked, what's your one piece of advice to an occupational therapy student for their future career?
Oh, just go for your dreams. Follow your dreams. And those of you who've been following social media today will see that I put out a tweet earlier to say, you know, that, you know, this is just such a huge honour and privilege for me. And I never, ever, you know, as a very young occupational therapist, starting out, never, ever would have dreamt that I would be here tonight delivering this lecture. So, you know, just be true to yourself, be true to your heart, absolutely, be devoted to the profession, because it is such a wonderful, wonderful profession, and just take the opportunities as they come along.
Yeah, oh, thank you, Jenny. I think that leads on really nicely to a question from Susan Martin from the University of Ulster. I'm sorry, Suzanne, if you're not at Ulster and I've got that wrong. But her question is, what advice would you give your younger self as a novice therapist?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, Suzanne, and we talk about this a lot actually in different circles. And you know, obviously being an ageing occupational therapist, then I talk about being a graduate at a time where we almost had the freedom and we had the autonomy to practice. We just couldn't necessarily support that with the theory, which in some ways gave us a tremendous amount of confidence to try and to explore different things. And you know, as we've come through the history of the profession, then there have definitely been different areas where, you know, you can see that confidence being impacted for therapists and feeling quite restricted by boundaries in many ways. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have boundaries, but I think, you know, there is definitely something about looking back and thinking, you know, just go for it. You know, what's the worst that you can do? And I say that, you know, all joking aside, I say that within the context of risk assessment and professionalism, obviously. But I think, you know, lots of people often ask me, how did I take the career path that I took, and how did I decide that I wanted to study at PhD level? How did I decide on various different opportunities? And I always say that I have never had any clear intentional career path, but something along the way has made me choose. I guess the one thing that has been clear for me is that I have always been really, really committed to the clinical practice aspect of it, and along the way have made some very deliberate decisions not to seek opportunities, because it would have meant that I would have had to give that aspect of it up, which would have been really difficult for me personally, because that's where I still to this day get my passion and my motivation to make a difference. So looking back in younger self, probably drink less, probably be a bit more responsible, but you know, in terms of professional practice, absolutely seize those opportunities when they come your way.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. Jenny, I'm sorry, I'm looking down occasionally because I'm scrolling and the questions are coming thick and fast, so we're not going to be able to do them all. But as I've said, Jenny will happily review and answer a selection of the questions, and that will be posted on the ARCOT website in due course. But I have a question here from, I'm afraid no name again, so I don't know who it's come from. So the question is, framing health impact in the terms of value for money is a contentious issue. So Jenny, how do you balance the use of the value for money as a measurement?
Yep, and that's absolutely right. And I think something that we all feel relatively uncomfortable with. However, and I guess perhaps coming, you know, more in terms of the leadership role that I have, there is a finite amount of money, and therefore, you know, there is an expectation and a responsibility for us to look at how we use that to best effect. So I think, you know, the way I guess that I justify that to myself is not about restricting the opportunities that are available to us as occupational therapists and the interventions that we offer based on money, but just being really cautious in terms of that realization that everything that we do does have a financial amount attached to it. So therefore, if we do a bit more of that, and that then helps further down the line, again, coming back to the concept of rehabilitation, you know, an argument for me that I've used routinely is about that, you know, that investment at the start of somebody's recovery and the potential savings, you know, further down the line, fits more comfortably with the way that I think, and also then enables me to build business cases and justify our contribution in that regard. But no, I absolutely understand the question, and it's not something that any of us are comfortable with, but equally we have a responsibility to use what funding is there wisely.
Yeah, I think the final question, looking at the time available, it's a question from Lily. How can we improve our impact on ethnic minority communities who are often mistrusting of services because of their experiences of racism, lack of inclusion, etc.?
Absolutely, and a really, really relevant question. And I think that's probably for me where the aspect of co-production is really, really important. And you know, I'd had some hesitations about you know, including in the lecture the comment around occupational therapy being a middle class, or being perceived as being a middle class profession with middle class solutions. But I think the reality is, and I mean, I know in terms of my own experience as an occupational therapist, that we see such a range and diversity of people within all aspects of our professional lives, and therefore our profession must reflect that. So I think co-production is a really good way, but I also, you know, say that with the realization that, you know, the way that we engage with people who use our services, we have to be really creative in how we organise that. But you know, what we've always done might not be the way forward. In fact, definitely won't be the way forward. But if we can reach a point of true collaboration and working closely with each other, then I think there's real potential for us to do things really differently.
And a final question for me, Jenny, just in the remaining seconds we've got. So this is going to be a one-word answer, hopefully, true politics style. What's the one action you can suggest for our audience today from your lecture this evening? What's the action they can do?
I think it's about thinking about what you're doing. So thinking beyond that immediate and obvious outcome to actually thinking in the wider context of what difference you're making.
Wonderful. Oh, thank you so much, Jenny. I'm afraid, colleagues, that we can't take any more questions this evening, but as I've just said, Jenny will be looking at the questions and reviewing, and we'll be posting a selection of questions and answers on the Royal College website. We also know that there have been many questions posed through Twitter, and we haven't been able to monitor everything this evening. So obviously, I'm sure Jenny over the next few weeks will be wading her way through all of that Twitter chat as well, which is really important. And just to remind you, colleagues, the full lecture will be published in the British Journal of Occupational Therapy, and we anticipate it will be in the February issue. So you will be able to read the full lecture as well as have access to the streamed content as well. So Jenny, just some closing thoughts from me now. That was just an amazing lecture. It's, you know, really given me some food for thought, and it's going to take me a long time to consider some of the questions you've provoked in me, and I've no doubt for our audience this evening, and they're probably already reflecting on the content and trying to work out how they can go forward from what you've challenged us with this evening. I think I need that time to reflect and digest those challenges you've posed us, particularly for me on truth, certainty, and the whole concept of the generation, creation, and interpretation of knowledge. I've never really considered how we have to re-engineer, going back to the title of your lecture, how we evidence the impact of occupational therapy. And I think that's really struck home with me. But there are a number of points you raised that have really struck me, to use the same phrase again. And that idea of entwining evidence and practice, I thought it was lovely this evening that you gave us a number of practice examples as well as evidenced examples through research to really show that there's a very clear link between evidence and practice, and we need to be more confident in explaining and using that. You really challenged us and posed us the whole question around, do we know if our occupational therapy is impactful, and what does that mean? The importance of innovation, collaboration, co-production, the whole relational concept of truth. Gosh, there was so much in that lecture, Jenny. I loved one of the slides at the very beginning where occupational therapy is the architect of our future. I can see that might be used in the future by a number of people and perhaps an organisation. I also loved this whole things about the 4 types of certainty or being certain, you know, whether you use I feel, I am, I know, it is. I think really made me question, when am I using that language and how do I need to change language in order to give the best occupational therapy that we can and show its impact. And your proposal that there's no absolute truth in occupational therapy, I think there'll be quite a few colleagues listening tonight who will be really trying to unpack what that means for them in their own practice and their own work. And then your whole model of impact, that we have to consider all aspects of impact from a societal, an economic, and the conceptual perspectives that is their worldview, an individual's worldview, not necessarily our worldview, and that we need to really think about that. So we are drawing to a close, colleagues. To our audience this evening, please do consider nominating colleagues who you feel have made or are making a significant contribution to the development of our occupational therapy profession. Information about nominations for the next Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecturer for 2021 will be shared on the Royal College's website in January, so do keep looking on how you can nominate somebody. And next slide, please. On behalf of the Royal College of Occupational Therapists with the Elizabeth Casson Trust, we will be sending you, Jenny, a special token to acknowledge that you are joining the esteemed group of Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecturers. And I'm sorry, but it is now time to say goodbye to all 1,200 of you who have been here this evening. Pretty much one of the largest audiences ever, certainly the largest audience ever for our first virtual streaming of the Elizabeth Casson. And that's just people that have joined us this evening, Jenny. And I know others will be listening and reading your lecture over the coming months. So I do hope everybody's enjoyed our first ever virtual broadcast of the Casson lecture, and thank you.